Okay, so to say, welcome to Professor Elizabeth Wells and Professor Toni Roberts from Mount Allison University in Canada. So, who's going to deliver our third seminar entitled The Feminist Classroom. So, Toni and Elizabeth, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Martina. Thanks for having us. It's great to be back with the IFNTF and connecting with some old and new friends. We're going to start out by just giving a very brief introduction to who we are and how we came to be doing this. Toni, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm going to click ahead here, or at least I'm going to try. There we go. So I'm Toni Roberts. You can find me at troberts@mta.ca. I was just mentioning we're both at Mount Allison, and I've been there for 18 years.
I've been there for 20, 21 years, yeah.
Interestingly, many years ago, I did, over 30 years ago, I did a women's studies degree. It was women's studies then, not women and gender studies. And I did a master's in feminist studies as well. Out at U of T, and then have done some other things as well. Some of you know I have an eclectic educational background. So Martina, I started in the hard sciences. My first degree was chemistry, and I have a master's in environmental studies as well. Anyway, got into some other stuff, got into women's studies and looking at gender and what have you, and have been teaching at Mount A on contracts and part-time, and also working as educational technology consultant and doing educational development. Yeah, and that's and we're here in rural New Brunswick.
In Canada, yeah. I'm Elizabeth Wells, and I have a degree in musicology. I'm a musical theater historian. That's my major gig. But I've also been very interested in teaching and learning, obviously. I'm a 3M National Teaching Fellow, and also interested in feminism and feminist theory. Not like Toni is, but in terms of doing it in the classroom, I'm really interested in that. So we've been giving presentations together on a variety of topics at Stelly and different places over the years. And this is one that we really like. So we thought it might be nice for the IFNTF to get our thoughts on this, especially with Toni's great knowledge. He teaches women's psychology, he teaches sex and gender. So he's really, really well versed in that part. And I'm, again, trying to incorporate into a humanities background. And so there's that part of it too.
All right. So here's the first thing. There are many feminisms. And so perhaps it was a little bit of a misnomer to say creating the feminist classroom, because there are various feminist classrooms. And so I wanted to introduce you to just some, very briefly, some different kinds of feminist perspectives. So when I do feminist theory, we often talk about these in more detail. So there are liberal feminists, and I call them the add women and stir feminists, which basically means this is not about structural change. This is really about adding women to the mix. And that's why it's add women and stir. There are radical feminists who are sometimes considered to be foundational feminists. And by the way, I'm talking kind of second wave. So I was talking about from 1960 onward. Cultural feminists who kind of replaced radical feminists. Cultural feminists and radical feminists were often separatist feminists. So some of you may have heard of feminists who wanted to set up their own communes, for example, and wanted to be separated from sexist, misogynist culture. This is kind of where that comes from. Ecofeminists, which is kind of like goddess worship kind of approach, or at least the notion that women are connected to nature in ways that men are not. Separatist feminists, as I've already spoken to briefly, which overlaps with the cultural and radical. Womanist feminists. Now, womanist feminists basically were a response to white feminists, and so it originated out of the United States. So these were mostly Black Southern women who were saying, wait a minute, we're not being included in this white academic narrative and in this discourse. And they used a different word to describe what they were doing. Postmodernist feminists and post-structuralist feminists, which are slightly different, but basically postmodern feminists, I've written, the individual is dead. And so that's the idea that the modernist period is kind of behind us, and we have to start thinking about ourselves in more social and different kinds of ways, let's say, not just as individuals, like atomistic individuals. Post-structuralists want us to think about power and language, and want us to be attentive to the fact that power is embedded in discourse, so embedded in language. Oddly enough, that's not the end. There are more. Now, we don't necessarily have to go through these others, but I just wanted to point to the fact that there are many, many more. There are standpoint feminists, for example, who talk about feminism being particularly vital in terms of your position, where are you? And that gives you vital or important information epistemologically that you wouldn't have otherwise. Multi-centered feminists, I-feminists, which are kind of like liberal feminists that have just been rebranded. Some have talked about post-feminism, and there are even different definitions of post-feminism. Some have said post-feminism means feminism is dead, and others have not. There are even data feminists. So Martina, I don't know if this might speak to you in a way, but this is basically the intersection of data science and ethics using a feminist intersectional approach. And this is a fairly new approach, which is kind of what we might call feminism 2.0. Feminism 2.0 is basically the intersection of internet communications and feminist analysis. So people like Sarkeesian, who founded Feminist Frequency, for example, I would put within this overall framework. And people are calling this the fourth wave. So the third wave from 1990 to about 2 or 3, 4 years ago, and now the fourth wave has started. So there are lots and lots of feminisms, and I apologize if some of you knew of these already, but I wanted to make certain that we had a common understanding before we continue on our way. Okay, so let's continue on our merry way here.
We are.
All right. So now you should be seeing so many feminisms in front of you. This, in fact, was a conference a few years ago in Mumbai. I grabbed this logo from. But anyhow, this basically means that there are various approaches that we can use. And as I've already suggested with liberal feminists don't necessarily want to enact structural change, but what they would want to do, as an example, is ensure that all girls have the same educational opportunities as boys. That's something that they would do. Now, if you were taking more of a post-structuralist approach, you would ask about who has power institutionally, how discourse functions in the classroom, who gains from certain social conditions, and so on. So they would perhaps critique sort of the interconnectedness of social systems that enforce domination, oppression, and submission. So it's a very different approach, as you can see. So there's no single answer to the feminist classroom.
So before we can create a feminist classroom, we're going to start now talking about what is feminist pedagogy. What are the methods and aims of feminist pedagogy? And so for us, that means there isn't one true feminism or feminist pedagogy. It's best to talk about feminisms and feminist pedagogies. Solar in 1995 notes that feminist pedagogy is a grounded response to feminist theoretical analysis of education. And since feminist theories are numerous, feminist pedagogies are plural. Feminist pedagogy is a theory about our teaching. Oh, go back.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry. Our teaching learning process that guides our choice of classroom practices by providing criteria to evaluate specific educational strategies and techniques in terms of the desired course goals or outcomes. These evaluative criteria include the extent to which a community of learners is empowered to act responsibly towards one another and the subject matter, and to apply that learning to social action. So there's an aspect of this that has to go back out into the world and reflected in the world.
Absolutely. And finally, I just want to say this is from Warren and Reingold in 1993. Feminist pedagogy is the educational manifestation of feminist theory, translating feminist thought into practice into a classroom setting. So pretty straightforward, ultimately, if we think about it. Now, we are going to go on, though, to think about, well, what do these have in common?
Right. So these are some of the common assumptions, regardless of how many feminisms and how many pedagogies you have, that there is a gendered component of the education system. We take that as a given, that no matter how much we would like to make it not so, there is a gendered aspect to our education system. And that, again, power is implicated in the system. Somebody always has power. Somebody is always brokering power. Somebody else wants to get power or to exercise power. But also very important, and this has to go with sort of feminist kind of worldview, is that there is a community of learners, that this is not just individual people sitting in a classroom, but it's a community in which all of this kind of power and this kind of discourse is being enacted. Also, feminist pedagogy believes that there are personal components of learning. And again, when we see things like universal design, when we think things like talking about different learning styles, learning, what's the word? Metrics.
Oh, metrics, sorry. Yeah.
You know, that all has to do with this individuality. There's also the notion of agency, of granting agency to our students, of students granting agency to each other, and that leadership and social responsibility are important. So apart from difference and diversity, which of course are very big words right now in our culture, these are actually old words for feminist pedagogy, and that this leadership and social responsibility is that going back into the world and changing the world by what you're doing in the classroom, regardless of what the subject matter is you're studying.
Excellent. Okay.
So here's a nice summary.
Yeah.
Feminist pedagogy is a theoretical and practical approach to teaching and learning that attempts to address inequities in the classroom, local community, and world by interrogating power relations in the classroom, fostering a community of learners, empowering learners to be active agents of their own learning, and encouraging learners to critique ideas and discourses, their own as well as others. The goal is empowerment for all learners. So we want to make clear that this is not just about making a feminist classroom for women, but making a feminist classroom for everybody, for empowerment for all learners.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. What's the simple answer? Well, the simple answer is that feminist pedagogy is about teaching and learning liberation, which makes me think of Freire, right? You know, even though we're talking, 30, 40 years ago, that was the whole point of that approach was, wait a minute, what's going on here in terms of the oppression of working class, working poor people in parts of, the global South, and sort of understanding that, appreciating that, taking that into the feminist classroom in the global North. So it's about that kind of liberation that Freire and others have spoken about for decades, and really feminists have spoken about for decades as well. All right. So I was thinking as well about people like Crenshaw, who gets us to think about intersectionality. Crenshaw was the originator of the idea of intersectionality, and that is the intersection of social categories like sexuality, race, ethnicity, class, disability, sex, gender, and so on. And so I thought this by Wheeler was a good encapsulation. And again, as I've mentioned, feminists have been writing about this for decades, and this is way back in 1988. Feminist teachers, if they are to work to create a counter-hegemonic teaching, must be conscious of their own gendered, class, and race subjectivities as they confirm or challenge the lived experience of their students. This does not mean avoiding or denying conflict, but legitimizing the polyphony of voices that and making both our oppression and our power conscious in the discourse of the classroom. So in fact, I don't know if any of you have had this happen to you, but I know, for example, that I've been challenged in the classroom, and rather than calling students out in those kinds of instances, I try to call students in. And I like that. I heard that 3, 4, 5 years ago, this idea of calling not just students in, but anyone for that matter, calling them into the conversation. So sort of what's going on here, and how do we in fact address this difference without in fact escalating conflict and without dismissing the students. And sometimes that can be as simple as demonstrating the research. All righty. So
the nitty gritty. What
Yeah.
can you do? What can you do to make your classroom this feminist pedagogical classroom?
So some of these, in fact, and Elizabeth mentioned universal design earlier, and some have noted an intersection or an overlap with universal design principles and some of the things that feminists and feminist pedagogues have been talking about for the last 30 or 40 years. So that includes things like choices in weighting of work. So why do we do this? Well, it builds on the strengths of students and their best work and provides a sense of agency, that they have some control over what's going on. Choice and type or kind of work. So that can be anything from art, projects, audio. People are doing a lot of podcasts now, I find, for my classes. They can be video productions. People are also doing things like Wikipedia pages, which I quite like because they generally make them live and put them out there. It builds on a sort of learning style. It builds on agency. Now, I know learning style is a little bit dodgy in some ways, but if we want, we could use a different word if we don't like learning style. Now, what happens with all of these is they start to do things like respect differences, not just in terms of sex, gender, but in terms of class, in terms of culture, in terms of experience, and so on. And sometimes you can even leverage collaborative work. So that can include things like in-class assignments where students are working together, in small groups. It can be collaborative tests and exams. So I started giving collaborative tests and exams many years ago, kind of out of necessity. So what happened was I was teaching in psychology, and in the psychology department, there was a very standard approach, and that is 2 midterms and a final exam, and which is not my way of teaching, generally speaking, and I didn't really like it. So I thought, well, what am I going to do? So I started investigating collaborative exams and tests. And in fact, I presented a couple of times, I think at Stelly and at Dow Teaching and Learning and what have you, maybe the AAU, on what I found came from delivering those collaborative tests and exams. So that's a really interesting way. It's a totally different way of assessing, and students sometimes resist a little bit. One of the things I did, though, was I gave students an out. I said, if you want to do this on your own, you can, but remember, 2 heads, 3 heads are better than 1. So when people are working together, it's really interesting. Assessment is kind of simultaneously happening sometimes when the learning is happening. And if everyone is okay with that, then there can be some really interesting results. And the creative projects, by the way, that I get students to do, because I'm not a fine arts prof, so if they do creative projects, I do ask them to write an analysis that connects their project to the actual research they've done and to the class content. And that's just a practical way of me being able to assess what's going on and for them to still demonstrate what it is that they've learned. But sometimes their work is really amazing. I've had students do stand-up comedy. I had 2 students do life-size Barbie. So they created a life-size Barbie, which lived in my office for quite a few years until it kind of disintegrated and fell apart, which is kind of interesting that Barbie fell apart. Her head was massive and her neck just couldn't support her. So these are the kinds of things, and the students remember this and they really enjoy it. And I think the learning kind of sticks as well. So I think pedagogically, there are some really great benefits to this kind of approach. So I like the collaborative stuff, especially when you give the students the opportunity to either work together or work on their own. So when it comes to my classes, that's what I do. I say, you can work alone, or you can work together, you can work in 2, or we can make this a whole class project. So once in a body class I do a sociology of the body class, we did exactly that. The whole class decided we're going to work on a singular project together, and we did. And we did an interesting analysis of a TV show, as a matter of fact, called Botched, which is all about cosmetic surgery that's gone wrong. So, there are really interesting things that you can do. And we did a really interesting gender analysis, race analysis, and so on around that show. All right. Shall we move on to the next slide, maybe?
There's 10 possible approaches. Yeah. Okay.
So some other things is, So perhaps leverage some other forms of communication. And I know more and more people are doing this, and that includes things like using online forums in your learning management systems, but it can also be things in the classroom itself. So for example, in my class, I get the students to do what I call classroom passports. They have to write down before class. It is literally their passport into the class, although I don't deny them access if they don't have their passport. But it basically is an answers to some questions, but also they come with questions that they then hand to me. So they don't have to put their hand up in the middle of class and say, I have a question about this. Can you explain that to me? So I will just look through the questions that they submit to me, and on the fly, we will answer them anonymously. So those are two ways that I address alternative forms of communication. Alternatives in evaluating participation is part of that as well. So I know that friends and colleagues of mine basically kind of keep track of who's spoken in a class, and that is how they keep track of participation. But there are different ways that you can in fact evaluate participation. So how do you evaluate active learning, or sorry, active listening, for example? So maybe get them to do short 60-second papers. You've heard about those before, where students can actually sort of write down what they're thinking about at that particular moment. And that becomes one way of evaluating participation, or can be part of. The other things that we can think about are acknowledging difference explicitly and celebrating it, not just ignoring it. So again, I'm using some of my own experience here. I put those things right on my course outlines that, we're going to celebrate difference, we're going to embrace difference, we're going to use it as a positive thing, and not just within sort of the multicultural, everybody, gets along kind of approach, because sometimes there are going to be some differences of opinion. And that means acknowledging someone's experience, but at the same time, keeping in mind that one experience is just that. And I've written here, be careful of the experience junkie. And what I mean by that is someone says, well, that's not my experience. My experience is this, and this is the way that it is. And unfortunately, your experience may not be the experience of others. And so part of it is also acknowledging that, right? So that means thinking about those power relations that we were talking about earlier, that post-structuralists have tried to make us more attentive to, so that if someone is taking up a lot of space in the classroom and saying, well, that's just not how I see the world, and that's not how I experience the world. It's about also opening up the space for other people to be able to present their experience, but also position that within the research too, right? Okay.
Great. Okay, so here I'm going to jump in and give you a little bit of a case study of how this has been working in my particular classrooms, and it's for a course called Women and Music, not unsurprisingly. I created this course maybe 10 or 15, well, probably 15 years ago. It's a very common course in music programs all over North America, that we look at women in music. There are a number of textbooks that deal with either in a kind of a historical survey, or with primary sources deal with women's involvement in music. You can see on your screen right now one of the iconography examples we have of women participating in a consort of early music. And so when I put this course together, my thought was not just, let's just talk about women in music the way we traditionally talk about history, where I'm going to lecture and you're going to take notes and there will be a test and you will listen to music and, all those things that Toni and I were talking about that we kind of resist. I thought I want to make the whole thing feminist. So the first thing I did was I made it into a seminar, which was reasonable because there were only 10 to 12 people in the class. So that worked very well as a seminar. And I had the idea that whereas I would give them articles and sometimes just topics to present on, there would also be formal respondents to the article presentations. Because you know what it's like when you get into a seminar and someone presents and everyone's sleeping, and then somebody else presents and then everybody's sleeping, and then the only person who's paying attention is the professor and the person who's presenting. And I wanted to really get away from that to create this community of learners. So for everyone who chose a topic, whether that was just something like, women rap artists, or misogynist critics, or whatever it was, there would be a respondent to whoever was presenting on that. So or if it was an article presentation. So what they would have to do is they would have to talk a little bit with the person who was presenting, get a sense of what they were going to do, then come up with, as we would at a conference, a respondent. I was also trying to get into there are some professional, skills and professional attitudes. But what's great about this is that you have the person giving their article, and then the person who responds will often bring in something completely new. I thought about this topic and I saw this video and I wanted to present this video and talk about how this relates to this particular article or subject matter. And so it makes that whole seminar, boredom break down, because many people in the room are responsible as a community of learners to respond specifically to what someone else is doing. And people love these respondencies. They want more of them. And we would have like maybe 2 article presentations, but 3 respondencies, sometimes 4, so that it creates discussion in a more natural, organic way. And then people also don't feel so, that they have to put their hand up or they're being singled out. They know when they have to talk, if they're shy, or they just don't feel comfortable extemporizing. One of the other things I did was have them decide how they would like to weight the assignments. And this is something that Toni talked about that he does as well. Would you like to have a major paper? Would you like to do a large presentation? Would you like to switch around some of the things you're doing, and I always encourage students to do things that are outside of their comfort zone, but let's face it, they're being marked and they want to do things that show to their strengths. So there was also an aspect of that. The other thing I did, which is interesting, but I don't know if I will continue doing it, is having people mark each other's presentations. So what I would do is I would hand out a small piece of paper and I would say, please make comments about the presentation and what mark you would give it. And then they would all hand them back. It was totally anonymous. They'd all hand them back to me. And then I would go over these with the person who had presented and say, okay, these people gave you an A. This person thought it was great. This person thought you should have done this a little bit differently. But it was a way of sharing the evaluative process. Now, of course, students were very nervous that these marks that were being given to them by other students would be counted. I said, no, they're not going to be counted. I'm not going to put them into my mark book. I just want to give you a sense of what other people are thinking and feeling about what you're doing without them having to stand up and say it to you. It's like my example in graduate school, we had the idea of the truth lady. And the truth lady was the person who would come up to you after your seminar and say, that sucked. And also you look bad, and this person would be on for like one term, they'd be the truth lady, and then they'd go off and someone else would have to become the truth. And we never actually got to it, but it's the same idea, the anonymous evaluation of your peers. The other thing that I wanted to include was that they could listen to any music they wanted to. So no matter what you're dealing with in women in music, whether it's an early music topic, whether it's music as performers, I also talked about women in different kind of roles. So I got away from the old fashioned thing of it's only about performance or composing. It's also about women as patrons. It was women as muses. It was women as the subject of musical compositions. So I tried to take a multivalent approach to how we would see women acting upon music, other than the ways that have always been reified by men, which is you have to be a composer or performer and nothing else counts. So apart from that, the other thing I did was we had negotiated final grades. So I would get together with the student, or last time it was on Zoom, I think, and I said, okay, I've given you grades for each of your assignments and you know whether you participated very much or not. What do you think you should get in this course? And people are very hard on themselves. They'd say, well, I think I was pretty good in the presentation. You like my presentation, but I really think I could have done this more or that more, the other thing. And I'd say, no, I think you did it really well. I'm going to give you a better mark than you gave yourself. So I wasn't inflating marks or giving, ridiculous marks, but it was a conversation that was negotiated. And I never had anybody, even if I gave them like a C+ or a B-, which is, a terrible grade nowadays, I guess, would ever contest it or say, I don't think that. They'd say, yeah, you're right. So all of those things were built into the class structure, both in what happened every day in the classroom, to what they were able to listen to, what they were allowed to read, what they were allowed to research, what they were allowed to do for their final projects, while taking this very, as I say, multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approach to how women could be involved in music throughout the ages in every aspect. And so I only had women and gay men take this course. I'm hoping someday that a straight man will take my course. But it didn't just become a sort of a male bashing sort of feminist rant kind of course. It was really kind of thinking more about what's happening in our culture today, particularly, and how all these things intersected. And we did end up doing some LGBTQ stuff in the course just because feminism led so obviously to that. And I want to talk a little bit about opera queens and the idea of gender and on some other things that were different from just women in music. But that's my sort of description, I guess, of what I did to bring these things to life in a real context. Now, this course is not a required course. It's an elective in the music department, but it is open to non-music students, and it is part of the electives for the Women and Gender Studies program. So I do get a nice diverse audience of people in the course. And we teach it about once every 2-3 years. So there you go.
Good stuff. It's interesting. So I'm teaching in the spring, summer, and one of the courses I'm teaching is gender relations. And I had my grade options. I generally have 3 or 4 grading options that alternately weight different items. And I negotiate with the students as well. What are we going to do? Would you rather have tests? They never want tests, by the way. But I throw that one out there just to show them I could give you a test. But interestingly, I did say to them, so what do you think about these weights? Or do you want to do something different? And I had a student say, well, here's what I'd like to do instead. They wanted to cut one of the assignments and instead put a further weight on something else. And I said, well, okay, I see what you're saying, but that's too much weight on that item because it's not a big item. So I said, let's think about this instead. And so there's a negotiation, at least with me, that happens quite frequently where I've said, no, you can't have that worth 30%. What do you think about making that worth 20%? And we'll add 10% to this other, to the final is what I did in the end. And they said, yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah.
So that's part of it, right? That's that agency we were talking about earlier, responding to differences in terms of learning styles. This person said, I don't do annotated bibliographies very well. I've been in your classes before and I've had to do one and I don't do well. Could we do something else? And so that was how that all came about.
Another thing I'd like to say is that the pedagogy is not just about these technical things. It's also about feminist emphasis on the physical, the body, the sexuality, all those things that feminism brought to us. So I was doing a course on pedagogy for senior students, all disciplines that I had developed under a grant. And it wasn't education writ large, like, you want to be a high school teacher, but it was just what are the theoretical underpinnings of how people learn things. And one of the things I pointed out to them on one of the first days was, okay, where am I standing in the room? What am I wearing? How am I talking? Am I gesturing? How have I chosen this particular classroom to create a certain kind of ambiance or a certain kind of feeling? How do you respond to me as a human in the classroom? And that was a really interesting discussion. I got them to think about it. They've never thought about that. They just think, oh, you go to class and the person teaches you. Well, no, it's a human teaching you. And what does that do to your experience? I think, in Women in Music, I made sure that we all sat on the floor in a circle. There was no podium, there was no upper level. And what I found really great about that is that very quickly they forgot about me. They just forgot I was there. Like I would come in with a question, obviously, a point, but they were talking amongst themselves and learning amongst themselves without worrying about what I'm thinking about them because I'm not standing at the front of the class. And that's, I think, a really important part of feminist pedagogy.
Yeah, oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. It gets us then to think about the actual space itself. So I'm part of this a research group called R-Piece, which is basically about community engaged learning and community learning, generally speaking. And we have a lab that we've set up on campus, which is trying to disrupt the notion of the front of the classroom. So we have chairs, why couldn't I think of that word? Chairs that are movable, desks that are movable, but there's enough space to move them. We have whiteboards around the entire room. We have lots of natural light. There's still the ability to present, but it presents at 4 different corners simultaneously if you're doing a PowerPoint presentation or a video presentation or what have you, again, to try to disrupt that. Now, of course, you said it earlier, students are still going to be evaluated. We're not silly in terms of understanding our positions of power, but at the same time, we can try to disrupt that a bit and try to be sensitive to issues of rainbow community members, for example, who, on a very practical point of view, about 400% more likely to be homeless, more likely to have mental health issues, more likely to to be underemployed. These things have an effect on your ability to perform academically. And as a result, it makes sense to try to be attentive to those. And of course, we know abysmally, we still have, the glass ceiling for women, where women are still making, 70, 72 cents per dollar for equivalent work, by the way, right? That men are making. So we're trying to, in a sense, be responsive to that situation. Okay.
Okay.
I think we went a little fast because we were trying to get things in. So we have some questions to consider. These are questions perhaps that you can consider now, or you can consider them later. But thinking about how we redefine equity in a feminist classroom, how we create the classroom community as a safe place that honors all its voices and silences, or do we even want to, right? Do we want to, how do we sort of envision that, I guess is what I'm getting at. What voices do we want to hear, and what voices do maybe we don't want to hear so much anymore? We've heard enough of those voices. I guess that's what I'm getting at. How do we emphasize process, like critical thinking, over product, like content, while still teaching important skills? So that gets to some of those creative kinds of projects perhaps we were talking about earlier. And how do we acknowledge the private, personal, and subjective experiences, as well as the public and personal and quote unquote objective? Now, those are just some questions that we were thinking about and threw out there. And by the way, for some reason, the next question is just what? I don't know what happened.
Something happened to that question.
Something happened to that question. It's like, what? Nonetheless, these are some questions for us to consider as we think about the feminist classroom. All right.
Final words. In order to transgress the boundaries in our teaching practice, we must be willing to query our multiple identities and positions: gender, sex, race, class, culture, ethnicity, ability, etc. Understand how those identities and positions shape our practice, reconceptualize power within the classroom, listen to our students' voices, and nurture a community of learners.
All right.
Of learners.
So that's, I know, pretty dense, but hopefully that gives you an idea of where we're kind of coming from.
And how you can do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's really important to think, again, not about just including women writers or musicians or people in your courses to cover in your survey or in your seminar, but how do you make the classroom itself feminist? Like how do you incorporate the theories behind feminism and this idea of teaching liberation behind everything you do?
Because, for example, I'll give you an example of, so I had the department head in Soch about 7, 8, 9 years ago. I said, oh, I'm going to show this documentary in my second sociology of sex and sexuality class. And she said, that is a horrible documentary. Why are you showing that to the students? I said, oh, because we do this critical workshop around the documentary, and here's what it looks like. And then she said, oh, now I understand it.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the content, because you can show some content that in this case was really reductive, was really sexist. Nonetheless, what we were doing with it was what was important.
Right.
I think that's it. The next thing is just resources. So these are some of the some of our references basically for our presentation.
Yeah. And so we thought that takes us about 40 minutes. We thought for the rest of the time we could have some conversation. You can either consider the questions we've already given you or come up with new questions or discussion. And that's our show.
That's it.
That's our show.
We went fast, I think,
A
few minutes.
Yeah.
Just a
but
few
we
minutes.
both talk fast, so that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a problem.